Science restricts our intellects to counting and measuring and producing mathematical models of things. When you look at scientific journals, you will almost never find an article that discusses underlying ideas, theories, alternative theories. We're not going to theorize about anything. We're not going to, use our minds to criticize old ideas. He was not a victim of schooling.
No, no, no. Yeah,
Into
exactly.
this profession, which is where change always comes from. It always comes from outsiders. And
Yeah.
so it is purely subjectivistic in its foundations and in its practice.
Welcome back to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues that are either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. In this episode, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Henry Lindner, who's a practicing physician and a philosopher from the United States. And he'll be joining my co-host Patrick Holmquist and I today to discuss what's wrong with modern science. Dr. Henry Lindner, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Perhaps you could kick us off, Henry, with some kind of just a small introduction to the audience who don't know you, and perhaps a brief explanation of how you got interested in both science and philosophy.
Well, my history is that I was raised in a very traditional Protestant evangelical home. Religion was very important to my mother, and she raised me with that, idea. Went to church all the time, and she loved me a great deal. I loved her, and so I really just could not go against everything she wanted from me, everything she wanted me to believe, until I left home. And when I got to college, and it was a Christian college, it seemed within a couple weeks I was just sitting there thinking, why do I believe this God story and the Bible and all of this? I think I'm just going to apply my mind to figuring out what really exists and what's really happening. This must be all accessible to my reason. And indeed, I'd always been a top student, so I had no problem trusting my own, thinking and logic and reasoning. So I started thinking for myself, and really, what began then was a multi-year process of gradually sort of weaning myself from religious beliefs. It was rather painful, difficult. You feel like you're outside, an outsider. You don't belong anymore to the congregation or even to your mother's faith, your mother's beliefs, or family. But that process continued, and then I read everything I could by just about everybody I could to try to find, an alternative. I looked at other religions. I then looked at many philosophies, and I found Ayn Rand, and much that she said, spoke to me, gave me an idea of what philosophy is, which I really didn't grasp until I read her book, Philosophy Who Needs It. And from her, I learned this idea that if you just get your definitions right, and if your ideas hit at the causes of things, as they say, if you cut reality at the bone, at the joint, with your ideas, you can make sense of things that otherwise just seem, very complicated and difficult to understand. And so I read everything, still did not find anywhere any sort of ready-made explanation of what the cosmos is, of what we are, how we got here, what our consciousness is. And so in 1990, I sat down and with my new IBM 286 computer and Lotus Symphony software and started to create an outline of the evolution of cosmic complexity, which I present in my talks. And I realized, from a big bang, which I do think did occur, but I think it was the result of a previous big crunch. I think we have an eternal cosmos. But from this big bang, you can chart out the cosmos' own evolution of higher orders of complexity. And it starts with, subatomic particles, and they form atoms, and atoms form molecules, and molecules find a way to get together to create this, replicating organism we call life, and so on and so forth until you get primates, you get hominids, and then you get a human species, us, who acquires this amazing trick we call language. And language is what makes us different from other animals, not a spirit. And medical school really, medical experience had cleansed me of like spiritualist notions when I was on the neurology wards. And I saw what brain damage did to all these fellows. It was a Veterans Administration hospital. And it really cleansed me of this idea that there was a magic ghost in the machine. I realized it's all brain function. The brain runs this thing we call consciousness. And so I lost my sort of last bit of spiritualistic sort of delusions at that point. And when I tried to figure out what atoms are made of, what causes gravity, what light is, what's the foundation of all this other evolutionary development, I ran into relativity and quantum mechanics. And I realized, because I'd read Ayn Rand, and she talked about the primacy of consciousness as a metaphysical epistemological paradigm versus the primacy of existence, I realized that Einstein was essentially imposing a primacy of consciousness epistemology on physics, that there is nothing but our conscious experiences. We're just going to describe what observers experience and measure, and not talk at all about what exists and causes any of this. And I realized that's why we can't move forward as a species. And I couldn't move forward until I produced a theory that worked to explain the cosmos, the physical world, and this cosmos that, apparently has this ability, or maybe you might even say strives to produce self-consciousness and self-direction through creatures like us in who knows how many places in the cosmos. And so that sent me on a, like a fact-finding trip through philosophy, the history of philosophy. I found out, why Einstein did what he did, and that in fact our whole Enlightenment philosophy that Ayn Rand praised was in fact a destruction of philosophy through people like Bishop Berkeley, David Hume, Ernst Mach, and then Einstein. And so we have no idea, we have no theoretical physics now, so no basis to replace the God magic theory. Relativity and quantum mechanics simply appeal to magical laws. They do not explain anything.
So would you say then that the fundamental problem with science is philosophical, essentially, and it's this being on the wrong side of that dichotomy, which is either the primacy of consciousness or the primacy of existence, as Ayn Rand coined those terms, essentially a subjectivist view of the world. Is that an accurate way of saying that sort of underpins, would you say, almost all of modern science and modern thinking? Is that fair to say?
Yes. Modern science itself, if you look at it very carefully, is anti-philosophical.
In what way?
It avoids,
Yeah, in what way? Can you unpack that a little?
Yeah. And I know a lot about it because, I studied all the sciences. I'm a physician. I know medical science and medical journals, not to mention has all the research I've done into physics and philosophy. But science restricts our intellects to counting and measuring and producing mathematical models of things. When you look at scientific journals, you will almost never find an article that discusses underlying ideas, theories, alternative theories. What you have is, as Thomas Kuhn described, you have these sciences, and I love sciences, but not the science with a capital S. Sciences are and should remain aspects of philosophy, branches of philosophy. But this science with a capital S was created by Bishop Berkeley, and basically made very powerful by Einstein's successes with using actually spatial concepts to produce these observer-based models we call relativity and quantum mechanics. And so all sciences try to ape or mimic relativity and quantum mechanics. We're not going to theorize about anything. We're not going to, use our minds to criticize old ideas. And as Thomas Kuhn said, what that ends up with is sciences are trapped in paradigms. And right now, that's modern physics is trapped in relativity and quantum mechanics. I was able to publish an article in a medical journal, about how thyroidology, the study of hypothyroidism and how to treat it, is trapped in an old paradigm. And these paradigms can be completely nonsensical and illogical, and yet people cling to them because that's what they were taught.
Yeah.
And so, yes, science itself with a capital S, that's how I put it. Is a corruption of philosophy. It's basically an anti-philosophy.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a useful distinction to say science with a capital S as opposed to the various sciences.
Yes.
Because and Patrick and I have discussed with other people, the problems of science before. And one of the things that I fear is that listeners will say, well, what do you mean there's a problem with science? 20 years ago, we didn't have smartphones. Now we have, we've got drones and all this wall-to-wall surveillance. Science must be improving. So what would you say to people who hold that view? How would you answer that in order to demonstrate that science is effectively stuck in a rut?
Sure. There are regions, there are sciences, let's put it this way, that do not rely on correct paradigms or proper philosophical foundations, or they already have proper philosophical foundations. For instance, biology is a healthy science, evolutionary biology, because of Darwin, because he took it out of the creationist magic mode. God magic made the species, and he put it into a cosmic, theory mode. Here's how it happens cosmically, naturally. Physics needs the same thing. So physics is a very, very sick science, so to say, philosophically. Needs to be put on a different foundation. But technologies, in medicine, surgery, these go very easily because it doesn't require the correct philosophical foundations and ideas, or those are already there. And so they work. They and technology is just, it works or it doesn't, the most of the basics of technology were figured out, of course, before Einstein: electromagnetism, ideas about gravity and inertia, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So that would be my answer is that sure, we are clever. Sure, people are doing lots of work in the various sciences.
Yeah.
But when they're stuck in a false paradigm, there's a huge problem.
Okay, so the sort of false paradigm of subjectivism basically only affects certain sciences.
Yes.
It does very obviously affect quantum mechanics and so forth.
Yes.
Interestingly, my interest is epistemology and the pursuit of truth. And great many people are subjectivists without even knowing it, and they invariably cite the double slit experiment as the scientific proof of subjectivism, which is ironic because there's a number of problems with the Copenhagen interpretation, yada yada yada. So
yes, if I may just add there,
yeah,
absolutely everything about the physical world is amenable to physical explanation. There's nothing magical about the double slit experiment. It's just waves. That's what waves do. Even electrons are wave-like structures of this fundamental spatial substance, which I call the Newton-Maxwell-Lorentz ether.
Mm-hmm.
It is the inertial and electromagnetic medium. Just think of those names: Newton, Maxwell, and Lorentz. That's where we got the foundations of all our sciences.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is, the answer is very simple. This is a philosophical problem. It is not a scientific problem.
Yeah, I mean, with respect to we'll move on perhaps from here, but just while we're talking on the double slit experiments, there are a number of, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but there's a number of logical fallacies around there. We seem to suddenly go from Young's double slit experiment that proved in 1801 or 02, I think, where he conclusively demonstrated that light was a wave, and then all of a sudden we've got the revamped experiments, 100 years later or so, where a science where the light was almost presumed to be a particle at the beginning of the experiment. It was sort of like a circular reasoning and a number of other problems with that. But would you say, maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves there, but would you say that the concept of the ether, which is obviously central in your talks, and obviously it's a very, very important fundamental concept to science, could you introduce us to the ether,
Sure.
and explain the fact that that it's been dropped by modern physics or modern, not necessarily the science, the sciences, or science with a capital S, or you take it over.
I can do that very simply. The first, most famous, most successful ether theory was Newton's mechanics. His absolute space is an ether, meaning it is a conception of space as a physical reality. In Newton's case, it was this physical space that resisted the acceleration of matter. And he didn't explain gravity properly, which we can do now with ether theory, but he just added gravity as a magical force, working within this single cosmic absolute space. Well, Faraday did a lot of work on electromagnetism and realized that electricity and magnetic fields existed. So if there's a field, it's got to be a field in and of something. Maxwell famously worked out the equations of electromagnetism and was an absolutely firm believer that he was describing the properties of space, of an ether, which was an electromagnetic medium that could support these light waves. And even his mathematical concepts led him to predict that light would move at the velocity c that we know today. Then came Lorentz and Poincaré. Lorentz basically created what's called special relativity, although Einstein corrupted his approach, which I can discuss. But remember, there's the famous Michelson-Morley experiment. That and a few other observations they found hard to explain by their existing ether concepts, which were primitive. We can do much better. And so they said, how do we explain this null Michelson-Morley experiment? Maybe the Earth, because of its gravity, sort of entrains or drags the surrounding ether into motion with it. They thought that was disproved by a phenomenon called stellar aberration, but it wasn't. They just had an unformed and false ideas about how the ether would work. And so here comes Einstein. And he had read Berkeley, Kant, Hume, Mach. He was a philosopher. In a way, I kind of identify with him. He looked to philosophy for answers, but unfortunately, what he found was bad philosophy. And so what he thought he would do is just get rid of this whole problem of where the ether is, how it moves, how can it do this and that, how it was a big puzzle. And he took Lorentz's equations and ideas, which are that the Michelson-Morley gave a null result because light, there's a length contraction of the apparatus. They knew light would move more slowly across an ether flow in the apparatus. But if you add to that a contraction in the direction of motion through the ether or in the ether wind, you can get a null Michelson-Morley result, even though there is an ether wind of 30 kilometers per second plus minus on the Earth's surface. Well, Einstein said, let's just do the simplest thing possible and say there is no ether. And so he produced this thing we call special relativity, which is basically Lorentz ether theory without the ether. And it immediately leads to paradoxes and problems. And I guess, I'll end with saying this. Physicists are actually think like ether theorists.
Yeah, by necessity.
But they use these subjectivistic models.
Yes.
That they personally, every one of them comes up with their own rationalization for why special relativity is true, even though it doesn't work at all, logically, philosophically. And then Einstein created this general relativity, which cemented the whole relativity idea in people's heads because he got some predictions right. But those predictions actually belong to a different interpretation of his basis of general relativity, which is the principle of equivalence of gravitational and inertial acceleration, which we'll probably get into later. So it really, general relativity is this flowing space ether. Special relativity is Lorentz ether theory. And the whole QED, quantum electrodynamics, with this idea that particles, are light as particles that move from here to there, which is nonsense. And, Richard Feynman admitted it was nonsense to think about light as particles, but you can replace that with wave theory.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's come back to some of that. I mean, one thing I would say is that you've mentioned Berkeley as sort of rescuing science from philosophy. Is that the way you put it?
No, Berkeley rescued religion from philosophy.
Sorry,
and he did so by creating science.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I was just wondering then, given that premise, Patrick and I are suspicious that Einstein rescued heliocentrism from ether theory. If we maybe Patrick wants to chime in here at some point, but the Michelson-Morley experiment, the alleged null result. There's much contention over that, and maybe Patrick's better qualified to pick up the ball here than I am. But we both suspect that Einstein, he had a lot of publicity behind him as well. But his ideas seem to serve very nicely to sort of rescue the idea of heliocentrism. And the idea that the Earth is traveling at colossal speed, orbiting the Sun, when potentially the Michelson-Morley, correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, experiment.
We'd say Michelson in America here.
Okay. Well, maybe that their experiments, this null result, perhaps this is an unwillingness of scientists to let go of an assumption, because of course there's a massive assumption of heliocentrism in everyone's mind, understandably. But proper science should look at the results of experiments as opposed to dismissing them when they don't fit with our hypotheses and our ideas. What would you say to that?
Oh, well, first of all,
maybe I should frame that more accurately. I mean, what do you think of the null result? I mean,
the null result has two possible explanations. Because there must be space that is an electromagnetic medium and inertial medium. It has to exist, otherwise you have no physical explanation for any fundamental concepts or physics. But there are two explanations that work for the null Michelson-Morley experiment. One is Lorentz's, and they call it the Lorentz-Fitzgerald contraction. If you add that, then you can have an ether wind on the Earth's surface of 30 kilometers per second and a null Michelson-Morley result. And that result has been confirmed over and over with more accurate measures. Now, the second explanation for the null Michelson-Morley was saying, well, we don't need length contraction. We just need the Earth as a massive body to entrain or pull its surrounding ether, its gravitational space, into its own freefall motion around the sun. So in that view, there is no ether wind at Earth's surface. Because space moves with Earth out to a great distance until the sun's entrainment of its space becomes dominant. The sun controls the space in our solar system. But I want to add a very interesting fact. Einstein essentially claimed he had reversed the Copernican revolution, because his subjectivistic relativity system says that any frame is equally valid to describe motion. So when he created general relativity, he had it in his head that he was going to make the Copernican revolution meaningless because it's just a choice of frame. So you can choose the Earth as your frame for describing the cosmic movements, or you can choose the sun as the frame. Well, that is such a foolish belief and or statement, because without the Copernican revolution, there would have been no Newton, Kepler, no Newton, no nothing, and no Einstein. So he basically, it's like Ayn Rand says, dropping the context, stolen concept.
Yeah.
He was absolutely wrong on that, but that's what you get when you try to get rid of the cosmos and relate everything to just observers in their frames.
The Michelson-Morley experiment is quite key to this whole disappearance of the ether from modern physics. Patrick, would you like to pick
sure.
up the thread?
Thank you, Niall. Yeah, and I've been looking into this as well, Henry, and we live in an amazing age where if we're interested in something, we don't need to go to the library and look at microfilm and stuff. We can look at the internet, and I think what's so amazing when you dig into a subject like this, ether theory versus particle theory, is that you find so much that you haven't heard about. I mean, you mentioned Newton. Well, Newton had a corpuscular theory
of light.
Of light. Yeah, he also claimed that light was made up of particle and thus only moved in straight lines and reflected like billiard boards. But then there was this Swiss mathematician and researcher. He was very good research optics, called Leonhard Euler. And he launched a critique against Newton's corpuscular theory. He was the first who, launched this ether light theory. And he did an analogy with sound and noted that light and sound behave similar. And then there was a back and forth, and you mentioned Faraday, and it was interesting with Faraday because he didn't have any classical education. Well, he was just a bookbinder that managed to get a job at the Royal Institution.
Right.
So he hadn't been schooled that forces only move in straight lines. So he noted when he experimented with electricity that, hey, this is circular. It's like a. So that's how he figured out the concept behind the electrical motor, because he didn't know what he should know.
Yes,
about.
He was not a victim of schooling.
Exactly.
Into this profession, which is where change always comes from. It always comes from outsiders.
Yeah, and to move on to the Michelson-Morley experiment and the problems we have there. And I want to be very clear with two things. I mean, it's a fact. We know that we have been able to do several experiments that confirms that Earth is rotating.
Oh yes.
We have the Coriolis effect, the Foucault pendulum.
Yes.
And we have interferometry also. Yes. I mean, they did interferometry.
Michelson-Gale.
Exactly, Michelson-Gale, yeah.
Yes.
And Sagnac did an experiment as well. So we know that Earth rotates.
Absolutely rotates, meaning really rotates, not relatively.
It's not exactly. It's not the entire space that is rotating around us. We are rotating. Yeah, so that's a fact. And it is also a fact that the Earth moves laterally in respect to the stars.
Yes.
Because we know that from stellar parallax. We know it from aberration.
Yes.
We can measure that. But, and here comes the thing, the question is, how much are we moving? Because if this motion is around the sun, we need 90 times the speed of sound 30 kilometers per second.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what has, that is what we have modeled our universe around now. This assumption that this is what we do. We move around the Earth. We move around the Sun 90 times the speed of sound in a 300 million kilometers wide orbit. Mm-hmm. And that gives the consequence that when we triangulate the distance to the stars using triangulation and measure the star parallax, we get enormous distances because the base of the triangle is 300 million kilometers.
Correct.
But what if, Henry, we are moving in respect to the stars, but we are moving at the speed as the Michelson-Morley experiment indicate, and that's very crucial here.
Which indicates no speed.
No, that's not correct. It indicates a speed. The Michelson-Morley experiment didn't actually give a null result. And have you heard about Dayton-Miller?
Yes. I have looked into that all very much. But I don't find the results convincing. And the resolution of all these questions comes through George Stokes' original theory to explain the Michelson-Morley result. And that is that, George Stokes said, it would be crazy to think that this Newtonian electromagnetic space just flows right through the Earth as if it's not there. So he believed in what he called the dragged ether hypothesis. I think it's more appropriately called entrainment. And by entrainment, what it means is when a very large body like the Earth or Sun or planets are in free fall motion, they're not accelerating relative to their surrounding space, they cause, and this actually comes naturally from the flowing space theory, which we'll probably speak about, where gravity is this radial inflow field of ether. And in order for a radial inflow field to be symmetrical, the planet must entrain or pull a lot of its surrounding space into this symmetrical radial inflow. This is entrainment. So in essence, the Earth is moving about the sun at 30 kilometers per second. It is not moving relative to its nearby space because that space is pulled into movement with the Earth. But it is rotating within that space, as you mentioned, because if you think about sink flow entrainment, the Earth could not pull its surrounding space into rotation with it. It can only suck it in. It's not a fluid with viscosity. So then the sun is entraining the entire space of the solar system and out to a greater distance into its motion about the galactic center. And with this concept, and then, let's take the GPS system. It works perfectly. It is the embodiment of this idea that space is co-moving with the Earth. Flowing space makes it co-moving. And yet those GPS satellites have a velocity, around the Earth, which is what also slows their clocks. Their clocks slow less because they're higher in the Earth's gravitational flow, where it's slower. And you get a system that works perfectly. So I believe there's only rotational ether flow at the Earth's surface, meaning about 464 meters per second at the Earth's equator. And I think some experiments may have actually shown that, but it wouldn't be a surprise to scientists because they know that the Earth is really rotating. But they have no way within relativity to really start to understand what that means.
If you go back to the Dayton-Miller experiment, because that's a controversy. I mean, that's been going back and forth, just like the controversy between ether theory and classical.
If that were true, if there were an ether wind up on a mountain, or when you do it in air, the GPS system wouldn't work the way it does, because the satellites would be going against the Earth's movement through the ether in one place, and they would go with it in another. So their clocks would go through a slowing depending on their varying velocities relative to this ether which the Earth is moving through in that theory.
Yeah, well, let's stay at Dayton Miller for a while, because because it's been criticized by Shankland. He said Miller didn't check his temperatures, etc. But the thing is, Miller performed thousands of Michelson-Morley experiments, and he did get a very consistent result, and that I think provided, I think it was 8 kilometers per second or something, but he did get a result. But the thing is that the fringe he got was much lower than what we get from Earth's rotation.
Right. Which is revolution. It's revolution, which is 30 kilometers per second, and Dayton Miller got 8.
Yeah. When I say rotation, I mean rotation around Earth's axis.
Oh, yeah, that's very slow. The rotational.
Yeah, 1,500 kilometers per second in respect to space. At the equator.
Do you mean 1,500 miles per hour? No, is it meters per second?
I think
it's 0.4.
Yeah.
I thought it was about 1,000
kilometers per hour.
Yeah,
yes. Sorry. Yeah, you're correct. What I also find so interesting is that Einstein actually commented on Dr. Miller's results. And he said, if Miller's results should be confirmed, then the special relativity, and with it, the general theory in its present form fails. Experiment is the supreme judge. Only the equivalence of inertia and weight remain, which would lead to an essentially different theory. And this is a straight quote from Einstein. So he commented on Miller's research. And, the thing is also that this is the problem we have with ether theory today. Before the Michelson-Morley experiment, Maxwell's equations and they were simplified by Heaviside. Everything just worked, no problem. But then we did the Michelson-Morley experiment and could conclude that interferometry can confirm Earth's rotational speed, but it cannot confirm Earth's speed around the sun.
Translational speed, yes, about the sun.
Yeah.
Maybe I could interject here. This isn't the primary purpose of this conversation, Henry, to convince you of anything, to be quite honest. but just for the sake of discussion, Patrick and I sort of have, shall we say, some further doubts about modern science on top of yours already. And, that we know a researcher, you were saying change always comes from the outside, it comes from the citizen scientists, and we know a researcher who has a model of the solar system based on Tycho Brahe's geocentric model, obviously not assuming that the universe goes around the Earth, that the Earth rotates freely. But this researcher, Simon Schack, has sort of worked and extended Tycho Brahe's model, and he has come up with a geo, what's it remind me, Patrick, is it a geo-binary model? What does he call it?
No, it's called geo-heliocentric. And that's in essence, that's what you could call a Tychonian model, or a Tychonic model, or a semi-Tychonic model. And the difference between a Tychonic model and a semi-Tychonic model is that a semi-Tychonic model has a rotating Earth, which is of course a fact.
Yeah, not geostationary.
There was too far of a stretch in the 17th century to admit that Earth actually rotates. It was only Copernicus at the time.
Right, because we don't feel the wind, we don't get flung off the Earth. There were lots of arguments.
No. And it's a question, it's interesting because it cannot be resolved geometrically. I mean, it could be the entire universe that rotates, and we wouldn't know the difference. It would be the same.
Yeah,
it's just so logically inconceivable.
It has to be determined through physical experiments, and they didn't have the know-how to do those physical experiments in the 17th century. They did some experiments, but since the effect is so small, they didn't notice any. So I said, yeah, well, Earth is still. I shoot arrows straight up in the sky on a wind still day, and it comes down at the exact same place. There we go. Earth doesn't move, Yeah. But then they did a Foucault pendulum and noticed the Coriolis effect, with long-range artillery, and of course the interferometer experiments, the Sagnac and that stuff. So I mean, now we know for sure. There's no debate about that.
Coming back to Simon's model, which is extremely compelling, Henry. I'll commend it to you at some point later on. But this model of Simon Schach's coincidentally has the Earth not rotating around the sun, but the other way round. But it has the Earth, whilst it does its diurnal rotation, it also moves around its own orbit. And over a period of years that coincides with what's known as the precession of the equinoxes.
It's a step in the wrong direction, and I'll put it among hundreds of alternative theorists who don't get it right from the start. They know, you see, we have nonsensical science right now. Relativity, quantum mechanics make sense of nothing, and so that spawns many alternative theories, because people know, hey, we need a better theory. We need to understand how the world works. And so I've been to many conferences. I've heard many alternative theories, alternative physics conferences. But the fact is, there's no physical way to say that an object the mass of the sun would rotate around the Earth. It's just utterly non-physical. The sun controls space out to a very great distance. Not to mention that all our satellite and moon, and probes that we've sent into the solar system in various ways, it all requires the sun to basically be the center of mass, and it is the center of mass. It's got 99.8% of the mass of our solar system.
Well, may I interject? The point I was going to make, and not necessarily dissing what you're saying, but the point I was going to make, just to complete that, was that in the motion of the Earth in this orbit that, as researcher Simon has come up with, it happens to coincide with the measured speed of the Dayton-Miller experiments. So that's interesting. And I was going to say as well, I mean, this is just an open and honest debate among rational men.
Sure.
Are we not making assumptions about the mass of the sun? The question of, and again, I'm not an expert on this model. Patrick perhaps knows a little bit more about it than I am, that I do. But is it not logical to first establish the motion of a system? If we consider the solar system, it is literally a system of heavenly bodies with a particular movement. And we're currently debating it. But is it not first and foremost is it not logical to first and foremost consider the visual evidence, the empirical evidence, to come up with a model that coincides with that before we bring in any assumptions of mass? Again, I'm speaking not as a scientist, but just speaking logically as a thinker who's trying to find the truth. So is it not hasty to dismiss a theory that I get is completely wildly at odds with convention? Let's not make any bones about that. But it has logical merit, and it doesn't jump to any conclusions about masses or how the system could be held together or be caused to move. But it simply, this model by Simon Schach simply accommodates, if you like, the visual evidence.
What visual evidence does it accommodate? It seems the only thing that it seems to be designed for is the Dayton-Miller experiments and trying to reproduce that 8 kilometer per second or whatever fringe shift.
There's a lot more. The particular model I'm referring to accommodates all of the historical astronomical data, in the same way that the other various...
But not in the simplest way, I would argue. I would find it impossible to even imagine that it would account for, say, the motions in our solar system.
Yeah.
As simply as the Copernican Keplerian system.
It's unrealistic to expect you to comment on something that you're not familiar with. So
I agree.
Perhaps we can leave that for another day.
Sure, yeah. We can talk more generally about science and the crisis of philosophy.
Absolutely,
of a society that has no philosophical abilities or whatsoever at this point.
Yes. So would you agree that all of quantum mechanics is a duff steer, is a wrong wrong trail?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because it's subjectivistic from its foundations. It does not, and this is actually recognized in the physics community by many persons have stated as much, and that is that quantum mechanics limits itself to producing a model to predict the observer's observations with his photomultipliers and in relativity rods and clocks, or whatever. They are and now with our our huge devices at LHC that detectors, it is just a system to account for observations with mathematical models based on the observer. At no point does quantum mechanics attempt to describe or explain what is existing and causing anything to occur. And so it is purely subjectivistic in its foundations and in its practice.
Does quantum theory, quantum mechanics, is that at the root of explaining atomic theory and nuclear energy and so forth? Because I've heard it said by another chap that we spoke to some time ago that is one of the alleged practical uses, you could say. He was very keen to make the point that quantum mechanics has no practical application. Allegedly quantum computers, of course, they're always about to happen, yes, but somehow they never quite do. Yes. But he was saying to us that nuclear energy theory and the nuclear bomb theory was the only sort of claimed practical application of that. What would you say to that? Is there any truth in that?
That's very simple. It requires, again, philosophical distinctions. Since 1920 or so, well, actually, quantum mechanics was created by Einstein, and he did so with his light quantum theory. So he basically went against the wave theory of light, even though he realized you can never get rid of the wave theory. And he said that light could be treated as a particle that moves from one atom to another, absorbed and emitted. So since that time, and especially since the 20s, all research that has, discovered a lot of things, that has given us a lot of advantages, but all that research is misinterpreted within the framework of quantum mechanics. And so the Achilles heel of it is the idea that light is a flying particle. That doesn't work at all. It's completely contradicted by the known qualities of light. Yeah. So that's why they resort to dualism, which is the death of philosophy. They say, we'll just accept a contradiction. Yeah. It's both a particle and a wave. So no thinking, no philosophy.
Yeah. Is it right, sorry to interject, yeah, but is it true to say that for something to be a wave, the properties of something being a wave or a particle are mutually exclusive? Is that true to say?
Technically? No, not really. But for light, absolutely. Light is a wave in the ether. It is a primitive wave. It has no other structure. It does nothing else. Okay. But I would say if we look at electrons, our best theory is that they are a kind of curled up light. They are light that is somehow, electromagnetic wave energy that is somehow confined, becomes, sort of forms some people say like a helix or some other form. So light or electrons are waves in that sense, that they are composed of waves, but they do constitute a particle, as they can be localized in space with, an extension that involves, how far their electric field extends. That's how big they are, actually, is as big as their fields. Another way of looking at particles that is very different from quantum mechanics.
Would you say then that, again, I'm not a scientist, would you say, is the idea of electricity being constituted of particles, is that a theory? Is it something we can be certain of? Some people, I've heard it questioned, so that's the reason I raised the question. Is that a done deal? What's your view of the electron? Is it a theory or a working hypothesis that works and we kind of all go along with it, or is it something that's nailed down?
I'm sure there are electrons, and I'm sure they have what we call charge, and there are positrons, and they have the opposite charge. Electrons somehow associate with nuclei, with collections of protons and neutrons to create atoms. And that's a real question. It seems that the electron wave structure sort of opens up and surrounds the nucleus, creating what we call a shell. And the electron takes on more waves. It creates a higher shell, or a larger shell. Electricity itself, are you talking about what moves in wires? That's a very interesting question, because Veritasium has a great video, and others have talked about the fact that really the wire is conducting electromagnetic fields. It's really what moves is the field energy in motion, and not so much the electrons in the wire.
So you could say it's more of a wave, could you? Is that
yes, it's a wave field process. The electrons move very little when current is flowing through a wire. They have a small drift, it is said.
Yeah. Obviously the electron is central to sort of chemistry, isn't it? And the bonding of atoms to form the myriad of chemicals that we know about.
Absolutely.
So there's very obviously, I'm not sure whether that constitutes proof of a particle called an electron, but it obviously is very much a working part of that theory, and we couldn't throw all that out. That would be silly.
Well, if I may interject, the irony, I think, is that when you look into quantum mechanics and also electroscience, they claim in quantum mechanics, they say light and electrons are particles impersonating waves. They behave like waves, but they are in fact particles, and it's the same in electroscience. But the absurdity or contradiction there is when we calculate, do predictions with mathematics, they use field equations, both in quantum mechanics and
yes,
and
wave equations, field equations. Everything is fields and waves.
Yeah, they use Maxwell's mathematics.
And the way it turns out is that those field and wave equations, they use them as probability equations to predict where you're going to get a detection. So they've turned real fields and waves into probability of detection mathematics. And that's what Richard Feynman describes perfectly in his book QED. He just took wave theory and turned wave amplitudes into probability of detection amplitudes. And so his QED is completely easily reinterpreted as real waves.
Quantum electrodynamics, just so for listeners that don't know what QED is that correct?
Yes, quantum electrodynamics. It is wave theory turned into probability of observer detection theory.
Yeah, it's just a kind of absurd shell around the working mathematics that was developed under ether wave theory.
But it all goes back to the ether taboo.
Yeah,
they're not able to talk about the substance which mediates all of this.
Yeah,
and so they have to talk about observers and their experiences. That's the only alternative.
So why do you What's the underlying cause of this ether taboo in your view, Henry?
Yes, it's religion. In essence, spiritualism, which I identify as, the false concept at the core of all religions. And that is that a spirit God just made the cosmos, by fiat and everything in it and all the animals and everything that happens on this earth. And that our consciousness is a spirit, participates in another reality altogether that is not natural, that is not cosmic, that is not physical. And so Bishop Berkeley saw very clearly, and he was brilliant in this regard. He saw that Copernicus's theory that the Earth is actually flying through space at 30 kilometers per second and rotating, and therefore contradicting the kind of Aristotelian and even Bible mentioned view of the sun going around the Earth. And then Newton's theory. Berkeley found Newton's mechanics to be a big threat to Christianity. And he said very clearly why. And that is because Newton posits that matter and absolute space just follow all these rules, and the universe works as this mechanical system, and no need for God to be running it. And so he saw natural philosophy, which is what Copernicus did, which is what Newton was doing. Newton said so. He called himself a natural philosopher. Darwin even considered himself a natural philosopher, which was after Berkeley. But he considered all of this cosmic thinking and explanation to be a threat to spiritualism, God, the Bible, authority. Chaos will come if we don't follow the Bible and do everything.
A threat to the establishment,
and the establishment. Yeah. Well, he was a bishop of the church, and so the church is making sure that people are not killing each other every day all the time. And so he said, let's get rid of Newton's space. So this is the first anti-ether theory that there was. And let us say that all that exists. Now, I talk about this, there are two ways to look at spirit and matter. One is dualism. And so most people are dualists. And before Berkeley, pretty much that was the conventional view. Descartes was a dualist. John Locke was a dualist. That means they think there's a spirit in a material body somewhere.
Spiritualism, as you just described. Yeah.
Yes, but there's both. There's material and there's spiritual reality. There's these two. Mm-hmm. Spirit God created physical cosmos. Spirit God put a spirit in every human. Berkeley said he saw that if we keep explaining how the physical world works, we're going to end up explaining with no need for God. Yeah. And so he said, there is no cosmos. There is no material world. It's all an illusion. And have you seen the movie The Matrix? Because yep. It's the perfect embodiment of Bishop Berkeley's theory, which is that God runs a spiritual matrix, and he coordinates our experiences with each other's experiences in this simulation. So there's no physical reality. There's no physical cosmos. You're an atheist if you say there is. There is only God. God controls everything. God is everything. God just arbitrarily decides that things will fall towards other things or not, or part asunder if he wants to. And that thinking basically permeated down through David Hume and Ernst Mach to Albert Einstein. Hume and Mach, interestingly, were atheists, but they still, and Mach didn't even believe neither in God or cosmos, but they clung to the idea that all we should do is describe our sensations and measurements, and we should never theorize about what exists and causes things.
So they stuck with the subjectivist model.
They stuck with the subjectivism, but they dropped the metaphysical, explanation for why we should be subjectivist, which was Bishop Berkeley's. He was the only one who gave a consistent reason for being a subjectivist, which is that there's no physical world. There's only spiritual world.
Yeah.
So no ether means no physical explanation, means no physical cosmos, means nothing to interfere with the God magic theory of everything. And
okay,
now, our physics is God magic. Quantum mechanics and relativity give us nothing but God magic rules.
Gotcha. So just to
no causation.
Just to sort of summarize that, correct me if I've changed anything that you said, but so the absence of the ether is connected to the subjectivist view. It's to sort of remove reality from the cosmos, as you call
yes.
it, from the whole picture that we're studying with science,
yes.
in order to preserve a sort of a mystical view, the God view, the spiritualism, as you described. Yes. So that's, yeah, okay. That's really interesting. I mean, as you probably know, Rand was very, she pointed at mysticism as sort of being the fundamental enemy of any kind of rational discovery yes. or scientific endeavor or anything like that. And she sort of she described it, or she defined mysticism as the belief in non-rational means to knowledge. I mean, I see that as slightly more fundamental than spiritualism. Spiritualism, as you described, this idea of a spirit that lives in the body, etc., etc., it is clearly a form of mysticism. But I must admit, I share Rand's conviction that mysticism is a very, very big problem, because it fundamentally scuppers our ability to discover our world, doesn't it? As soon as we remove that idea that we must regard things objectively, which is clearly your message, I believe, don't let me put words in your mouth, but as soon as we throw out looking at existence as something that exists before we got here,
yes, like, and apart from our consciousness,
absolutely, it was here first. We've come to be in it somehow. We don't know, but here we are. So yeah, there's this interesting distinction, isn't there? Spiritualism, mysticism. It seems to be the enemy of science. Would you agree?
I can explain this. Ayn Rand was not a scientist herself, not a natural philosopher. She was a philosopher when it came to understanding, basic metaphysical and epistemological concepts. But what I have done, and what I'm talking about, is putting, an actual cause or entity in the place of what she called existence. I put cosmos, because that is existence. That is what we see. That is what we experience. That's what we should call everything that exists.
Yeah. Well, why do you not use the word the universe? I mean, I get what you're saying. I've always used the word the universe, and maybe it's got other connotations you don't like. But the word cosmos tends to have slightly religious connotations. If you look
really?
up if I've looked up definitions of cosmos, cosmology. And there seems, maybe I got it wrong, okay, but there seems to be mystical.
It's just the Greek word.
Okay.
And I love Greek, everything Greek, because that is when philosophy started. It literally began on the western coast of Turkey, in Ionia, with Thales of Miletus. And I had the pleasure of actually living there for a year and a half when I was with the US Air Force. And the first philosophical speculation about the world that we have recorded is Thales saying everything is made of water. So everything changes, water changes forms, and it gives rise to all this stuff. Well, his pupils improved on that very quickly. And one of them, Anaximander, said, no, everything must come from some other substance, which is not water, but gives rise to water, and rock and air and so on and so forth. He called it a peron. And so, that's philosophy, is trying to explain it. Yeah. And mysticism, again, here, I think I'm giving the real core truth about what all mysticism is. I think it all arises from some sort of spiritualist conception. You may be right. Maybe you can say there's a mysticism that isn't involved with spiritualism. I don't know. So why would anybody be irrational unless they're trying to, hold on to an irrational concept like, there's a spirit world and we're all going to die and go there.
So why do you not use the word universe, just out of interest?
Yeah, I like the Greek word
Just
cosmos,
okay.
and it also gives us a way to give a name to this philosophical approach. I call it cosmism.
Yeah. Fair play.
Universalism doesn't quite work, that's got other meanings and so forth. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I
No, I
just
get
think
that.
it's a better term.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm fully on board with your. I've read some of the pieces on your website, and I'm fully on board with what you say about spiritualism and the problems associated with the Judeo-Christian, the sort of the three Abrahamic religions, the
Yes.
monotheistic religions, that their roots, etc., etc. I mean, I do see this as a fundamental problem, but here's an extra key to the puzzle, or an extra component to the puzzle, if not the key. To me, it seems that mysticism has uses. It has uses because you can trick people. So if you can persuade people to accept things on faith, if you can persuade people to put aside their critical faculty and their common sense and accept, that you can walk on water and have a virginal birth, and etc., that this is immensely powerful because you've disabled their epistemological processes. You've enabled
Yes.
false ideas to be slipped into their minds.
Yes.
So
Which
another
has a corrupting effect on everything.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a disastrous effect, but the question remains why. And it seems to me that another really important coordinate you mentioned when you were back at in college, trying to suss out the world, and Patrick and I, and I'm sure many others in the audience, have gone through a similar process where you're trying to sort of empty your head of all the nonsense, and you're trying to sort of start again, as it were. I think a really important coordinate to bear in mind is that some people have always been wanting to control others. This is just the way it seems to me. We only have to reference the slave industry.
Yes.
This is the slave trade. It's
Yes.
been with us all through known recorded history.
Yes.
And arguably it exists still now. There's still slaves being traded in Libya, I believe. But the point is that some men have always been controlling others, and
Yes.
there are various quotes from lots of famous people that
Sure.
back up that you in order to control people, you need to deceive them. Hence the connection with mysticism. So it seems to me that mysticism is a political tool. It's a tool of deception. It's a tool of control, ultimately. So what do you, I mean, I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but what do you think when you factor in that undeniable, I would say, fact of human life, i.e. some people, some sections of culture, there'll always be a ruling class because some people
Yes.
are always wanting to dominate, whether it's to live parasitically or to just exploit them, expropriate their values. When you factor in that, does that or do you factor that into your worldview at the moment and into your reasoning as to why the ether is pushed out? Does that sort of tie in with your thinking?
Well, it ties in very much, because not only is philosophy the primary threat to religion, it's the primary threat to authority. So you have to prevent people from becoming philosophers, or you will have people understanding, what's wrong with their society, what's wrong with their institutions, where the exploitation is occurring, and so forth. So that is why philosophy needs to be suppressed and is ruthlessly suppressed and sidelined. And basically treated as just a bunch of fluff of people talking nonsense, and that's literally what academic philosophy is.
Yeah, it has become nonsense, isn't it?
Otherwise, it would not be allowed to exist.
Yeah.
If philosophers in academia would actually, if they became philosophers instead of academics, they would be a threat to power.
Yeah.
And so that's huge. But it's and so yes, mysticism I associate very much with spiritualism and religion. But what we are taught instead are large numbers of secular myths and
Absolutely.
lies.
Hence my enthusiasm to label mysticism as the sort of fundamental problem, if you like, because mysticism can be secularized. You know, if you believe in any nonsense, you know, Father Christmas or fairies at the bottom of the garden, or if you believe that there's no ether or any other things,
that banks should have the right to create money from nothing.
Absolutely, etc.,
But you
etc.
see, where's the mysticism in that? It's more a matter of just, you know, misinformation and you know, and so on. So,
well, the mysticism,
again, we're just disagreeing. It's a verbal kind of disagreement over what are we going to call mysticism. You're associating it with all sort of non-thinking, irrational.
No, I'm labeling it as the idea that there are non-rational means to knowledge. In other words, you can put aside faith. Yeah, you can put aside your critical faculty, and it's okay. I mean, and that is a massive no-no. We function by using our critical faculty.
Of course.
Sorry, I feel you are right about that.
Who's right?
You have faith.
No, I was just joking because I'm exactly.
Oh, feel.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the heart of the matter, and I think, you know, it's easy to bash on spiritualism and religion, and I could do that as well. But I think what we need to be careful about is to look at, you know, our own belief system and the other common belief system, because I think they are belief system, and investigate the rationality in those. And when we find problems, we should be very suspicious about them.
Yes.
And I'm curious also when we look at it, because we can conclude that science has been corrupted.
Yes.
You know,
it is consistent. Just think, science works perfectly well with religion and authority. Yeah. That shows you how limited it is. It is not philosophy. It's counting and measuring and finding models that work.
Yeah, and that I would say depends on what meaning we put into the word science. But if we refer to science as you probably refer to natural philosophy, or that you use the scientific method and reason in a proper way. That way of doing science or research or natural philosophy has been corrupted.
Yes.
Science doesn't work that way anymore. And then I would say the follow-up question would be, how much of it is corrupted? And how far back do we need to go? Because I find it interesting. You mentioned Copernicus and Ptolemaios. But do you know who Tycho Brahe was? Or,
yes.
Do you know who Riccioli was?
Who?
Riccioli.
No.
He was the Jesuit who wrote the Almagestum Novum. That was, it was the reference book within astronomy for a century. And by the time, the 17th century, they had discarded the Ptolemaic model. There was, consensus, it doesn't work. But they also didn't think the Copernican model was correct. What they settled on was the Tychonic model, or a variation of it. But I know, and I will agree that there was one major flaw in that, and that is that Earth were still the immovable center of the universe, which is wrong. But I think we have, this history that, first it was Ptolemaios, and then it was Copernicus. That isn't correct, because in between we had the Tychonic model, and that's a very interesting model.
Yes, I haven't investigated. I haven't seen a reason to do so or purpose to do so. But I agree. Every idea should be should be considered. Here I am begging everybody to consider my alternative ideas or different ideas. How can I say, no, I'm not going to consider yours? But at the same time, academia is right about a lot of things. They do make sure that there are not direct contradictions between their models and experiment, for instance. And the technology has to work, and so on and so forth. So,
there are contradictions in climate science, aren't there, though? Because, I mean, if you look back historically, you can see that the record shows not only that it's been warmer and there's been considerably more carbon dioxide than there is now, but you can also look and see that this thing about oceans absorbing carbon dioxide, and you can see this idea of the relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You can see that it's actually it's the other way round from the way that it's often proclaimed. So without even being a scientist, one can see that there are massive problems with very popular ideas such as climate change. Logical fallacies such as 97% of scientists agree, or therefore it must be true, just as though numbers make any difference. And there are numerous examples where, I'm just a layperson investigator. I'm somebody that's interested in finding the truth. And it seems to me that in so many of the stories across what passes for modern science, and I'm not sure if that's with a capital S or not, perhaps it is, so many of the methods and the claims are, demonstrably not true. Would you agree with that, Henry? Is that your view?
I have not done a personal in-depth, research, which would take up far too much time and effort. But I can say that I very much have the feeling that a certain paradigm has been imposed upon climate science. And I know of many persons who are very, very knowledgeable in the field who have, and I've seen very convincing presentations of their refutations that, man-made carbon dioxide is the major driver for an increase in temperature. So many sciences, as I said, are corrupted by false paradigms. Yeah. And so, I think that one it's quite possible that is what is going on there.
Yeah, I find it interesting as well to note the political usefulness of certain ideas. I mean, call me extra suspicious, but I am an investigator. Well, I consider myself an investigator. So when I notice that an idea is extremely politically useful for changing people's behavior en masse, that raises my, that rings alarm bells, and it causes me to want to ask further questions, because it provides, the motive in the crime, if you like.
That's where detective work is very much akin to natural philosophy. The detective looks for the cause, weighs all the clues and the evidence. Yeah. And
maintains,
as you said,
full context. Yeah.
Cui bono, who benefits, is one of the factors any detective would look at.
Yeah. So what's your view, just changing gear here slightly, or just changing subject, what's your view of medicine? Because medicine is a very, very big part of science with a capital S. Yes. You're trained in it, Henry, and I believe you still practice. Yes. Maybe you could clarify what it is you do practice. I think it's psychiatry. A lot of people.
I started out in psychiatry, and I realized it was stuck in false paradigms.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Either the biomedical model where all our psychological problems are due to some genetic disorder that nobody ever found, or the Freudian analysis. Those were the two models that were there when I was in my 1 year of psychiatry, and I realized neither of them were telling me were giving me any real information about what people are and why they do what they do and why we have the psychological problems we do. So I dropped out of psychiatry. I did general practice for 20 years. And I kind of stayed in very low-key environments where I could actually pursue philosophy and theoretical physics in general, studied psychology on my own. And so I like every other doctor, I at first thought that all fields of medicine are like perfectly pristine, wonderful science. But in fact, many fields, it's the same thing. wherever you need to have correct ideas to interpret complex situations, you're much more prone to error because you fall into some paradigm that you're taught. And so, like in medicine, all of medicine is basically being pushed into a, diagnose and drug paradigm by the pharmaceutical corporations.
Yeah, which clearly doesn't address fundamentals.
No, don't worry about the cause. Here's a drug that helps a bit. And so that's what they have turned doctors into drug pushers instead of finding the cause. And when I looked carefully, I found some causes that are very much overlooked. One of them are undiagnosed or undertreated endocrine problems, like insufficiencies of people who don't have optimal hormone effect. They're not diagnosable by the current system because endocrinology is stuck in 4 false paradigms. I'm going to talk about those at a conference this weekend. One of them is that false thyroid paradigm, which I wrote a paper about. And so there's, I call it pharmaceutical medicine. It's not natural philosophy medicine or natural medicine. It doesn't look for causes. It stops at the level of finding a drug that helps. And most of the research is funded by pharmaceutical corporations, corporations which, by the way, no corporation should exist. I think this is the very clear philosophical conclusion when you look at what they are and how governments create them and what kind of havoc they wreak everywhere.
Yeah, they are problematic, aren't they?
Yes, they are amoral for-profit machines.
Yeah. There's something, isn't it the name corp? It's something to do with dead, isn't it? It's a dead body, a corporation.
Yeah, corpse.
Corp.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to know, isn't it, that pharmaceutical medicine or the medicine in general, again, it seems to have, or the setup of it, the way it's set up, does seem to have implications for control. Again, I notice. But what about psychiatry? Because what's that manual, the DCM something or the general
DSM 4 or 5 or 6? Yeah. I don't know where it is right now.
The equivalent of the Bible for
diagnostic and statistical manual.
That's the one.
And I realized right away it's a Chinese menu.
Yeah, it seems,
that's all it is. You get all these symptoms. This gives you this diagnosis. Yeah. And here are the drugs that we have tested for people with that diagnosis. So you give them those drugs.
Yeah, it does. It struck me as sinister. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I've been very interested in it over the years, and I've read, here and there about psychiatry, psychology, and it seems to me, again, fundamentally, illogically, or maybe part of this wrong paradigm. Perhaps you can give us your opinion on this. That to diagnose what we could call dysfunctionality. Okay, you meet some people and they're functional and they, everything's working in their life, and you meet some people that are just dysfunctional. They're not doing it right. Mm-hmm. There's some method in their thinking and their use of their consciousness, yes, which there's a dysfunction. So to me, to my layperson way of looking at it, again with my detective hat on, it seems to me that the fundamental is that people have learned to use their consciousness incorrectly. Now, of course, that's a very big concept, and our parents can mess us up by effectively teaching us by demonstration.
That's the big problem right there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Parents and infancy, and what happens. Yeah.
So my point is that the DCM or DSM, or the manual,
DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual,
DSM, that seems to sort of label all of these various dysfunctions as diseases that need to be treated. Yeah. And it's almost as though you catch them. I mean, I don't know. But again, I noticed that there's rather a sinister implication, isn't there? Because, you could almost call, if you had some sort of totalitarian political system, and the likes of us three logical thinkers are sort of kicking up a fuss, protesting that this isn't true and that isn't true, that could easily be labelled as a disease, and therefore you end up in a straitjacket in some institution.
We have oppositional defiant disorder.
That's the one.
It's a real thing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that is sinister, because again, that smacks of political usefulness, and
Soviet
again,
Union all over again. Yes.
Yeah. forgive me for finding a common thread there, but political usefulness of ideas, it seems to be a very common thread through this problem with science that we're discussing here.
Things being thrown around all the time right now, like labeling anybody who tries to theorize about what's really happening and why as a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
that's just a way to shut people up.
Yeah.
And because the method of philosophy is theory. Yeah. And that is detective work. Yeah. And they wouldn't even try to deny that conspiracies exist because they're everywhere. You know, it's a category in criminal law. You know, it's just.
Yeah. Have you heard of a chap called Stefan Lanka, Henry?
No.
Is he a virologist, Patrick? I think he was a virologist from Germany. And again, you know, we're run the risk of being labeled as conspiracy theorists, or perhaps more accurately, we should term ourselves conspiracy realists. But there's doubt cast on the practice of virology. So again, simply, and I'm not a scientist again, but simply through observing practices, observing methods, observing how certain experiments are performed and whether or not, for example, they involve controls, you know, to make sure that you're isolating one variable at a time. Mm-hmm. You don't need to be a scientist to know these things and to be able to effectively look at a science. You know, I'm not fully versed with reading these papers, but you can read these papers and find out that the actual methodology is just not science, it certainly isn't what I think the three of us would agree would be something approaching proper scientific method. You know, if you don't isolate variables, you can't claim to. So cutting a long story short, there are questions, serious logical questions over you know the claims about viruses. You know, this particle that originally was named a virus because it meant poison, I understand. My point is that without being a scientist, you know, we can look by scratching just a little bit beneath the surface. And you know, I'm a busy man. I've got young children. I've got lots to do. But it does seem that with a modicum of scratching beneath the surface, we can uncover fundamental logical flaws in what's claimed as the method of the science of virology, which for me casts very serious doubts when, once again, you know, you look back at the recent pandemics and lockdowns, and again you see just how politically useful this idea is. Do you yeah, so originally my question was, do you know of Stefan Lanka, but do you share any suspicions around those subjects, Henry?
Well,
or those areas of
certainly, science? Certainly. You know, I think the evidence is very strong that COVID was created in the laboratory. The work was being done there to enhance these coronaviruses and so on and so forth. Vaccinations for everything are not properly tested. There are no controls. They cover up the negative results that often occur in persons who are vaccinated. There too, it's a societal paradigm. You know, it's basically, we can help people by vaccinating everybody, and we're just not going to listen to any evidence to the contrary. So, and virology, I haven't studied virology itself in more depth, but I can certainly say that about, you know, you're talking about the layperson being able to understand these things. That's because they were not indoctrinated into whatever paradigm, you know, this group of scientists use. And those paradigms can be utterly foolish in terms of what they tell people. But if, you know, this gets us to a point I wanted to talk about, which is, you know, you were smart enough to unschool your children, as I did. And the problem is schooling. It destroys an individual's philosophical development. Just imagine from day one, they're told, you're lazy, you're stupid, you're not going to learn anything unless you sit down and do what we tell you to do, and do all these exercises we tell you to do. it's not learning. It's coercion. It's employment where they're not getting paid, nor do they have a decision to be employed to do all that work. And so this is what creates people who move their way through academia, are very good students, and they just accept whatever paradigm is imposed upon them when they get into their specialty. Like physicists, if they don't accept that relativity and general relativity, special relativity, and quantum mechanics are the way to do physics and the only way, they're out of the program. They're gone.
Yeah.
They have to leave. And so it weeds out everyone who thinks for themselves in many fields, and leaves those who are compliant and who will go with the paradigm.
Yeah. So just to be specific, then you say it's anti-philosophical schooling. Can you just be really specific? Yes. Am I right in understanding that it's anti-philosophical because it doesn't encourage questioning? Is that the essence of it, or looking for fundamentals? How can you be really specific?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with encouraging questioning. It's about controlling 30 young people and pushing them through these exercises so that they will do well on some standardized test. All real questioning comes from the individual. And children are full of questions, as you have seen. You can't stop them from asking questions and looking for answers. Well, school stops them. It makes them tired of learning, fed up with it. They don't want to read books outside because they already have to read too much crap that they don't want to read. They're taught some version of the solar system or whatever, and they immediately forget it because they were not asking that question at that time. So it's the antithesis of learning, and it destroys their confidence in their own minds to understand reality. And maybe, like you too, I wasn't destroyed completely by the schooling process because I was the top student. I was voted most likely to succeed. I'm always the 98th percentile, doing well in the classes and making everybody else look bad. But even I realized, really, it was actually a while after I began questioning religion, I realized I didn't understand the world at all. What's the relationship of a star to a galaxy? How big is the cosmos? What is gravity? I realized I didn't have any answer to any of these questions. And I succeeded. I did college physics and college biology and, pre-med and med. So it's a very different thing to ask questions yourself and pursue the answers. That's where learning occurs.
Yeah,
absolutely. It does not occur from memorizing something that's pushed on you.
Well, it's interesting that you raised home education because, as I've said to Patrick before, I've sometimes questioned my choice and its consequences. I mean, I know that I know from reading your website and your work that your daughter went on to do PhD physics. Yes. I assume now from a homeschooling background. I have young children, that are, two teenagers of nearly 14 and nearly 16, and I've got an 18-year-old, and I regret to confess that I've been unable to pass on my interest for books. As you can see, I love books. I think they're fantastic. They really, really are a means of gaining knowledge, but so far, my 18-year-old hasn't started reading, and I must, I confess from my own memory, I went to a reasonably good school, the oldest Catholic public school in the UK, and I wasn't a big reader. I only discovered reading when I started backpacking and traveling around the world. That was when I discovered books. I was probably about 19 or 20. So my question to you was going to be, how did you get your daughter into reading?
First of all, the reason you and I had to do so much reading is because we grew up deluded. We were seeking answers. Your son is not deluded, I would imagine. He hasn't had any ridiculous belief system, magical anything forced on him.
Yeah, that is true.
And so all these books, I've got more behind me than you've got behind you. I read them all looking for answers because I was desperate. I needed to find a way to understand the world. Your son doesn't need that. He has other interests. You know, Ayn Rand said it herself. She said, I do philosophy so that other people don't have to.
Yeah,
so
like
in essence, you saved him from having to re-educate himself through reading books. He will read books when he has a purpose in doing so, when he finds something that he can only get from books. But all these books, most of them, you can condense the author's ideas into like 2 paragraphs. And you read an entire book to get those 2 paragraphs or define those 2 paragraphs that have some meaning. That's what most books are. But also, I'll give you a inspiring tale. My daughter raised her without schooling whatsoever. She just played games on the internet, communicated with kids, drew for fun. Now, she had some problems with infections. That one of them, I believe, was in the uterus, and the second one she got from 2 ticks here when she was 10 years old. She was psychologically very kind of unhappy. She needed distraction. And so at age 14, I said, Val, okay, we need to get you into some other situation, get you out of the house. And so, having had no schooling whatsoever, no mathematical instruction, she started out at a community college near our home, taking college biology and basic algebra. Well, she was the top student in both. And soon she took college algebra, and then she took calculus. She taught herself geometry, never had to take a course. And it just went on and on. She won when she was, much younger than all the seniors in a local university. She won their integration bee. And the mathematicians who have dealt with her said she comes up with solutions we'd never seen before. So, and then from the minute she got into classes, she said, Dad, these other kids, they're not interested in learning. They're just showing up and they're leaving as soon as they can. They don't ask questions. They don't really try to do the lab work. They pencil whip everything. And so those kids are destroyed. She was not destroyed. And as a result, she was the favorite student of every professor she had. One of them told a friend that it's students like her that make it possible for me to get out of bed in the morning and teach, because she's actually there to learn.
Yeah.
She would ask questions. She would correct the professors often, or show them a better way to do something. Yeah. And so she was the top STEM student at Penn State. She graduated with 3 degrees because she had started taking these college courses when she was 14.
Yeah.
They don't need schooling.
No.
When they choose it, they will go for it. If they don't choose it, let them live whatever life they want to live.
I think there's a complication in there. I mean, I take it your daughter is considerably older than my young ones, 14 and 16 and 18. I think the advent of the game the computer game has been an interesting mix as well. But so, I mean, to sort of summarize and try and begin to draw some strings together, you clearly identify philosophy as the sort of fundamental or wrong paradigms, correct me if I'm wrong, and incorrect philosophical ideas, or perhaps even the just rejection of philosophy as being fundamental to the problems with modern science, and by extension, I think from reading some of your work on your website, with the predominance of the Judeo Abrahamic religions, almost responsible for, dare I say, most of the problems that our culture is going through at the moment. Is that fair to say?
Yes, Christianity, Judaism before it, and Christianity were always at war with philosophy, and because it is the alternative to their God, magic, do what we say, kill all the heathen, whatever ideas. And philosophy is their enemy, and philosophy is the enemy of, it's all about ideas, Nigel. We are apes that speak. And so we are controlled by the ideas in our heads. Yeah. And philosophy is just good mental hygiene, you might say. It means that we take on the responsibility and put in the effort to question all the ideas we've been taught, see if they line up with the facts, create better theories if we can, and therefore make certain that we have, an integrated understanding of the world and humans and their lives and their civilizations and their cultures and their institutions. So only philosophy does that for us, not science.
It's been a great conversation, great listening to you, Henry. And the last thing you said here, I really resonate with, and I made a note here, and I think as I agree, it's so much about ideas and words, and when we think about words, what meaning do we put in them? And sometimes we can very much talk above or besides each other because we have different meaning attached to a word. Mm-hmm. And I think when the problem comes when we're emotionally attached to an idea, because then we become unable to analyze it rationally. And any criticism of that idea is then often perceived as a personal attack. If I say that is wrong, and someone liked that idea, they say, oh, you said I'm wrong. And then you get an answer as a personal attack. And I also think it's a problem today because we are conditioned to react to everything emotionally and become angry. And, rational discussion is not encouraged in our society today.
Because people don't even believe it's possible to resolve differences through rational discussion anymore. So it becomes a shouting match.
Yeah.
Is that a measure of how irrational our culture has become?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's getting worse by the decade. It's getting worse by the year, practically. That there is no philosophical competence, no philosophical intelligence. My daughter herself, she said, one day she realized what philosophy was, and she too understood how it helped you to make sense of all these conflicts and, alternative theories and ideas. I mean, you can actually wade through it and start to figure out which ideas work and which ideas are wrong. Takes philosophy, and it takes philosophy to have a conversation that is fruitful.
So how do you think, Henry, that we can revive philosophy? How can we, it has got a bad name. Most people just give it a great big yawn and think it's irrelevant. And obviously, due to the sort of propaganda or the sort of, not directly propaganda, but if you try and read up on modern schools of philosophy, it is all just nonsense. And so, I wouldn't blame anyone for giving it a complete swerve, which is tragic when, as you point out, you believe it's a massive part of the solution. So I mean, do you have any optimistic suggestions as we sort of bring the conversation to a close or draw strings together? Have you got any advice or anything else?
The internet has changed things. And so people have exposure to alternative ideas. They have exposure to more facts. I think that is bringing about something akin to a return of thinking, at least for many persons who take advantage of this. But my primary idea about how to restore philosophy is to fix this theoretical physics we have. I think it's the fulcrum. I think it's the very basis, because without a theory of what the cosmos is, what matter is, what space is, you can't produce a theory of how it produced us or understand ourselves as a product of this natural cosmic evolution. People say God, I say cosmos. I say the cosmos does this because it can, you almost might say it strives to produce greater complexity where it can, because it sure did on this earth. And I think that's a better theory than the God theory, because it sticks with what we actually see and experience. But replacing this spiritualistic, subjectivistic physics, look at quantum mechanics. People draw these spiritualistic, implications from it all the time. The Tao of physics, and everything is mind, and and relativity too. Relative reality is relative to the observer. It does promote philosophical relativism.
So, if I may interrupt, I would say that, Henry, that theoretical physics has kind of replaced proper philosophy, because they go about, well, I made an equation and there may be 20 universes, blah blah blah, and here we give out the Nobel Prize for showing mathematically that a part of reality may not be real. That was the Nobel Prize in 2024. I think they had discovered that part of the universe might not be real or isn't real. And it's not philosophy; it's bad philosophy, and it has replaced proper philosophy. So I so much agree that that's the one of the root causes of the problem.
They don't realize their models are wrong for their purpose.
No, because they work mathematically.
Yeah,
and that's also the problem, because mathematics is a language.
Yes,
I can say the pink unicorn flew in the sunset. That doesn't mean pink unicorns exist. And if I do an equation of how far a unicorn flies depending on its weight and length, that doesn't make unicorns real either. But that's the way they reason in physics. Hey, look, I have a mathematical formula here. What's wrong with it? Nothing.
They're often believers in mathematical idealism. That's what Einstein was. And so they believe that their mathematical, equations are the laws that make everything happen, when in fact they're just the descriptions of what the physical world is doing.
Yeah. Descriptions as opposed to explanations of how. It's as though they conclude that reality is in mathematics rather than mathematics is in reality.
Right.
Yeah.
As Patrick said, the proper understanding of mathematics is that it is language.
But it's a great language.
Yes,
it's excellent.
It's language.
It's a language.
We invented it. Humans invented it. It doesn't pre-exist humans and run the cosmos. Space does, and space has smallest parts. So, like, I call them cells at the Planck scale, maybe. So everything is quantifiable in that respect, in that space itself has units or smallest digits. But language, mathematics is a language we invented to deal with quantities. We improved that language over, hundreds and hundreds of years, but that's all it is language. It's just language that manipulates quantities, as opposed to our other words, which talk about entities and their actions and so forth.
Fantastic. Well, does anybody want to say anything by way of conclusion? If there's, again, Patrick, if you had one last question, please fire away at this time. Or Henry, if you have any sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to sort of pull a few strings together, please do.
My last thought would be, in addition to reforming physics, we have to save children from compulsory public education. If we get children to be raised in a much more free and natural way, free to pursue their interests and answer their own questions, they can seek teachers, but not in a compulsive system. If they want to take a course, if they want to learn something, let them do so. Let them develop lots of skills and learn, real crafts and trades that are actually useful in life, instead of wasting 12 years in classrooms, being told to memorize things and having their philosophical their wills literally and their philosophical capacity destroyed. So those are the two things I hope for, is a reform of theoretical physics to become an actual physical theory process again, and save children from schools.
Bring back the ether.
Yes.
Or the cosmos. So you
natural
sort of,
education, which is what humans did through most of our history. It was only in the US, it was in the late 1920s that compulsory public education began. Yeah. Look how brilliant people were before it.
Absolutely. It's unreal, isn't it? People don't realize that, everybody thinks, isn't education wonderful? But they don't realize actually that there were a lot of very learned people around way before public education.
Even more learned in most senses, I believe, which really became a problem when everybody got 12 years of compulsory schooling. Yeah. Like generation to generation, I think the philosophical competence declined.
Yeah, maybe literacy went up, as in literally being able to read the newspaper, but not actually not learning.
That's controversial. That's controversial.
Yes,
there. People have spoken about how many copies of certain books sold, like Thomas Paine's book on American freedom.
Yeah,
immense numbers of copies. Which indicated that large numbers of the population could read. Reading comes naturally to children, Nigel. They don't need to be taught it.
Yeah.
They just need to be allowed to teach themselves, as my two girls did. I didn't teach them reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't teach my children to read either. That's something they picked up.
Because they knew it was their responsibility to develop that ability, and they did.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, what a fantastic conversation, Henry. Thank you so much.
Nice talking to you too also.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom. And would you like to tell us just a couple of words about your website? Because I'm sure listeners might like to find out a bit more of what you have to say.
Most of these ideas I've talked about here and a lot more detail are available. It's henrylindner.net. I have a big opening essay about spiritualism and the evils it causes. And then, various essays about physics, about child rearing, about child education, about the matrix we live in. A lot of information is there. Oh, and my analysis of the Old Testament, which I think is an eye-opener for anybody who wants to believe that the Bible is a good thing.
Fantastic. I concur with that. I've read that myself, and I also like your essay, if that's the right word, on the Matrix. This podcast is called Living Outside the Matrix. Yes. This podcast is all about busting out of that matrix of ideas that seems to control us.
False ideas that control us.
I would certainly I'll put a link to that page on your website, because I thought that was fantastic.
Great.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Henry.
Yes,
and thank you, Patrick, for co-hosting with me today. And thank you all for listening. And do remember to check out the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's lots more interesting stuff on there. It is a fundamentally philosophical website, busting lots of myths in the mainstream media today. So check that out. And do join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.